This week, we're going to focus on questions of genre, paying particular attention to one genre of literature, the Gothic. But before we get into what Gothic literature refers to, I'd like to spend some time discussing what genre actually is and what function it serves. In casual social contexts, chances are that when you use the term genre, you're referring to, for example, films, television, or maybe even food. When we use genre to discuss film, we are usually using it to describe a particular kind of film. For example, science fiction, drama, thrillers, horror, romance, these are all genres of film. But why are these kinds of classifications helpful? What do they tell us about a text? If you think about it, when you use genre classifications to refer to an artifact like film, what you're really doing is making a claim about the kinds of themes, plot lines, characters, or narratives one might expect in a particular text. For example, in a superhero film, you might expect to come across certain themes like nationalism or patriotism, romance, rivalry, and good versus evil. In a horror film, you might expect to see ghosts or demons, and perhaps different kinds of good versus evil themes than those you might come across in a superhero film. In both of these cases, genre helps us make sense of a text and enables us to see how certain texts come to mean different things in different contexts. A genre, however, doesn't just tell us what to expect in a particular text. It can also play with our expectations by leading us to assume one thing based off of our previous understandings of certain conventions of a genre, and then subverting and rejecting those conventions. Think, for example, of the romance genre and its traditional elements. In romance film or literature, we might expect to come across two characters who fall in love and at the end live happily ever after. Sometimes, though, a text will actually deliberately lead us to expect that this will happen, but then ultimately withhold the kind of closure or resolution typical to the genre. This kind of play with expectations, however, doesn't only happen on the level of plot. It can also occur in characterization. Think, for example, of superhero comics that, rather than completely rejecting or typecasting the villain, instead attempt to humanize them and encourage empathy from the audience. Or, on the other hand, they might emphasize the shortcomings of the superhero themselves as a way to accomplish the same goal. Both of these kinds of characterizations, in a way, might actually function as an implied critique of the binaries of good and evil that have typically structured the superhero genre. In this way, they might be making a statement about the social and cultural expectations, norms, and constructs embedded in our understandings of genre. In literature, genres are used in a number of ways. Sometimes a literary genre might refer to a particular time period or cultural context. For example, in the literary world, the genre of Romanticism does not refer to romance as one might imagine, but instead to the artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual movement originating in Europe in the late 18th century. In this sense, Romantic literature does not refer specifically to narratives of love or romance, but instead to the aesthetic trends of the Romantic era. Romanticism, for example, emerged as a challenge to the Age of Enlightenment, which was a time in Europe that emphasized rationalism and objectivity. Therefore, Romantic authors and artists during this time emphasized the power of emotion, imagination, intuition, and creativity. Another genre, like Romanticism, that refers to a particular cultural or historical context that we have already learned about briefly in this course, is that of Modernism. Think, for example, of the story we read in the first week by Katherine Mansfield, Miss Brill. Modernism, of course, isn't just the state of being modern. Rather, as Drew pointed out, Modernism was a literary movement that emphasized the interior psychology of characters, the experience of isolation from others within society, and questions about the meaning of life in an era of decreasing confidence in the goodness of humanity and the existence of God. Like Romanticism, Modernism in some ways also sought to question the objectivity and rationalism of Enlightenment thought. Although there are many other literary movements and genres worth discussing, for the sake of clarity and comprehensiveness, we are going to focus this week on the genre of Gothic literature. While we might be most familiar in casual context with the term Gothic as referring to the identity performance of people, for instance, the people wearing all black, metal studs, and chains that we might call Goths, Gothic literature refers to the historical period of Gothicism, which emerged alongside Romanticism in the latter half of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. Generally, while Romantic authors and artists tend to focus on the power of imagination, physical and emotional passion, and pleasure, the Gothic tends to focus on the darker possibilities of Romanticism. In traditional Gothic literature, we might come across haunted castles, ghosts, and seemingly crazed characters. The atmosphere and setting would be likewise dim and dreary, the text producing a sense of dread based on the possibility of terror. Some conventional Gothic texts with which you might already be familiar are Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Bram Stoker's Dracula. While both Frankenstein and Dracula are from the English Gothic tradition, you might also be familiar with the work of Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote within the American Gothic tradition. While we could discuss the differences among the English and American Gothic at great length, there are definitely some key differences worth noting. While both traditions share a fixation with the darker possibilities of the human mind and the terror of the unknown, the American Gothic revolves around specific kinds of fears having to do with, for instance, the Puritans and the darkness of religion, anxieties about the unknown that stem specifically from themes of vastness and isolation, about the and the cultural and embodied terrors of civilization and society. Many of these themes, particularly in the early American Gothic literature, are rooted in the fear experienced by early settler colonialists in the Americas of unexplored territories and seemingly foreign and threatening forces. All three stories that you are reading this week are of the American Gothic genre. Each story is representative of different approaches to the American Gothic. Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, for instance, mobilizes generic elements of early American Gothic fiction that deal with questions of death, decay, and mourning. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper belongs to the genre of the female Gothic, which emphasizes the darkness and terrors of patriarchal society. And finally, Shirley Jackson's The Lottery deals with themes of family, community, and societal norms and expectations. I'll talk a bit more about these stories in depth in the next videos.